The motel room was too quiet for a man who lived in sound. Winter Park, Florida, March 4th, 1986. Richard Manuel hung still, the piano man finally out of keys. On the nightstand, a note unfinished. "Don't wait for the dawn, it's already here." He spent his life singing Release and found it only in silence. Just hours earlier, he had been on stage performing with the band, the group he helped build, the brothers who knew him best and couldn't save him. The show had gone well, or as well as shows went in those final years when the magic felt more like muscle memory than inspiration. Richard had performed Chest Fever, his fingers finding the familiar patterns on the keys, his voice reaching for notes that came less easily now, but still carried that distinctive ache. The crowd had cheered, demanded encores, left satisfied. Backstage, Richard had seemed calm, almost peaceful in a way that should have alarmed everyone but didn't. He had been through so many cycles of despair and recovery that his bandmates had learned to read his moods like weather patterns. The storms, the clearings, the false springs. That night felt like a clearing. He hugged his bandmates one by one, held them a beat longer than usual, told them he loved them. Rick Danko would later remember thinking it was nice to see Richard in good spirits. Levon Helm noticed the extra-long embrace but attributed it to sentiment, to the bond forged over decades of shared stages. Richard's last words to them were simple, almost mundane. "I'm okay now." 3 words that carried a weight no one recognized until it was too late. Were they reassurance or farewell, a promise or a lie? In the days and weeks that followed, each member of the band would replay that moment obsessively, searching for signs they should have seen, warnings they should have heeded. But hindsight is a cruel lens, making obvious what was invisible in the moment. He wished them good night and returned to his room at the Travelodge. What happened in those final hours remains private, known only to Richard. Did he sit at the window, watching the Florida night? Did he think about his children, his ex-wife, the life he had built and dismantled? Did he play imaginary piano on the motel room desk, his fingers running through songs one last time? Or had he moved beyond thought into some region of pure feeling, beyond language, beyond music, beyond everything except the certainty that he could not continue? The note he left, "Don't wait for the dawn, it's already here," suggests he had achieved some kind of clarity, arrived at a decision that felt inevitable rather than impulsive. But Richard Manuel had spent his life translating emotions into music, not words. The note's meaning remains as enigmatic as the man who wrote it, open to interpretation, resistant to conclusion. But Richard Manuel had never been okay. Not really. Not since the weight of his own gift had become too heavy to carry. And now, in a Florida motel room that smelled of cigarettes and old carpet, the song had finally ended. When news of his death reached the music world, the response was immediate and devastating. Robbie Robertson, who had written alongside Richard for years, who had watched his friend's slow dissolution, released a statement that tried to contain grief too large for words. "Richard had the most soulful voice I ever heard, and the saddest soul I ever knew." Levon Helm, who had called Richard his little brother, would later say simply, "When Richard sang, angels stopped to listen." But the questions came quickly, as they always do after suicide. Why? What happened? Who failed him? The answers, like most truths about complicated men, were neither simple nor satisfying. Richard Manuel didn't die because the world was cruel to him. He died because he had given away pieces of his soul through every song, every performance, every moment of beauty he created, until there was nothing left for himself. The music came easy, living didn't. To understand how Richard Manuel arrived at that motel room, we must travel back to where it all began, to a small town in Ontario where a boy discovered that piano keys could speak the language his mouth could not. Stratford, Ontario, Canada. April 3rd, 1943. Richard George Manuel was born into a working-class family in a town known more for its Shakespearean theater festival than for producing musical prodigies. His father was an auto mechanic. His mother worked in a factory. There was no musical pedigree, no family tradition of performance, no indication that this quiet boy would one day help define the sound of American roots music. But Richard possessed something that couldn't be taught or inherited: an innate musicality, a connection to sound that seemed almost spiritual. By age 9, he was teaching himself piano, not from books or lessons, but from listening, from feeling his way through jazz records his older brother brought home, from gospel hymns he heard through church windows on Sunday mornings. His hands found patterns that made sense to him even when nothing else did. Music became his first language, more fluent than English, more honest than speech. His family recognized his talent but didn't quite know what to do with it. Musical genius in a blue-collar Canadian town in the 1950s wasn't a career path. It was a curiosity, something you did for fun at local talent shows, not something you built a life around. His father, a practical man shaped by Depression-era scarcity, worried that music was an unstable foundation. "Learn a trade," he'd tell Richard, "something you can count on." But Richard had already found what he could count on, and it wasn't carpentry or mechanics. It was the way certain chord progressions could express what his mouth couldn't, the way melody could create order out of internal chaos. There were early performances, school recitals, community centers, church basements, where Richard's gift became undeniable. When he played, adults stopped their conversations mid-sentence. Children sat still. The room changed. Years later, Garth Hudson would describe Richard's playing as architectural, saying he built structures of sound that people could inhabit, spaces where emotion became tangible. But Richard himself never talked about his playing in such terms. When asked to explain his process, he'd shrug and say he just did what felt right, as if his hands were smarter than his conscious mind, as if the music came from somewhere beyond intention or effort. But the gift came with a price that wouldn't be fully tallied for years. Even as a child, Richard felt things with an intensity that bordered on the unbearable. A sad song could make him physically ill. Beautiful sunsets left him weeping. He experienced the world as raw sensation, unfiltered and overwhelming. Music gave him a way to process these feelings, to transform them into something structured and shareable. But it also meant he was always translating, always mediating between the chaos inside and the performance outside. The gap between those two states, between what he felt and what he could express, would widen over the years until it became unbridgeable. By his teenage years, Richard was playing in local bands, dive bars, anywhere that would let him sit at a piano and disappear into the music. He wasn't flashy or showy. His gift was subtler than that. When Richard played, something happened in the room, a shift, a deepening, a sense that the music was accessing something true beneath the surface of ordinary life. People couldn't always explain what they were feeling, but they knew they wanted to hear it again. He played piano like he was translating sunlight. School bored him. Social conventions confused him. But music made sense in a way nothing else did. It was a language he was fluent in, a space where his sensitivity, which made him vulnerable in the regular world, became his greatest strength. In those early years, music was salvation, the thing that gave shape and purpose to a life that otherwise felt shapeless and purposeless. Could this early dependence on music as the sole source of meaning and identity have set the stage for later tragedy? Was Richard Manuel learning to be an artist? Or was he learning to disappear into art because being himself was too difficult? In 1961, 18-year-old Richard Manuel got the call that would change his life. Ronnie Hawkins, a rockabilly singer with a reputation for spotting talent, was looking for a piano player for his backing band, the Hawks. Hawkins had already assembled an impressive lineup: Levon Helm on drums, Robbie Robertson on guitar, Rick Danko on bass, Garth Hudson on organ. They needed one more piece, and Richard Manuel was it. The audition was less about technical skill than about feel. Hawkins wanted to know if Richard could hang, if he had the stamina for the road, if he could match the energy of a band that played 4 sets a night, 6 nights a week. Richard sat at the piano and played, and within minutes everyone in the room knew. This kid from Stratford had something, not just talent but soul, the kind of depth that can't be faked or learned. Joining the Hawks meant entering a world Richard had never imagined. Suddenly he was playing honky-tonks and roadhouses across the American South and Canada, learning the blues not from records but from the source, absorbing the raw, unfiltered emotion of juke joints and dance halls. The schedule was brutal, driving all night to the next gig, sleeping in the van, living on truck stop food and adrenaline. But Richard thrived, or seemed to. For the first time in his life, he had found his people, musicians who spoke his language, who understood that music wasn't something you did, it was something you were. The Hawks were tight, a unit that functioned almost telepathically on stage. But they were also a brotherhood, bound by shared experience and mutual respect. Levon became the big brother Richard never had, protective and grounding. Robbie became the creative partner, the one who could take Richard's musical ideas and shape them into songs. Garth was the professor, always experimenting, always pushing the sound in new directions. And Rick was the heart, the emotional center that kept them connected. For Richard, who had spent much of his life feeling isolated, this sense of belonging was intoxicating. These men didn't just accept him, they needed him. His piano playing, his vocal ability, his songwriting, it all mattered. He mattered. And for someone who had spent years feeling invisible, being seen and valued was a drug more powerful than anything that would come later. On stage he belonged, off stage he dissolved. But there were signs even then that Richard's relationship with performing was complicated. He loved the music, loved the feeling of losing himself in a song, but he hated the attention. Crowds made him nervous. Applause felt like pressure, like expectation he couldn't possibly meet. He developed a habit of drinking before shows, just enough to take the edge off, just enough to quiet the voice in his head that said he wasn't good enough, that he was fooling everyone, that sooner or later they would realize he was a fraud. The other members of the Hawks noticed but didn't worry too much. Everyone drank in those days. It was part of the lifestyle, the way you unwound after a show, the social glue that held touring musicians together. Levon Helm, who had seen his share of self-destructive musicians, thought Richard's drinking seemed manageable, controlled. Robbie Robertson, focused on the music and the trajectory of the band, saw Richard's pre-show ritual as performance anxiety, something he'd grow out of. They didn't see or didn't want to see that for Richard, alcohol was becoming less about celebration and more about survival. Less about enhancing the experience and more about making it bearable. Years later, after everything had fallen apart, Levon would say in an interview, "We all drank, but Richard drank like he was trying to drown something. The difference was the rest of us were drinking to feel good. Richard was drinking to feel less." It was an observation that came too late to matter, like so much wisdom about Richard Manuel, recognized only in retrospect, when it could no longer save him. But in those early days, the drinking seemed secondary to the music, just part of the bohemian lifestyle they were all embracing. What mattered was the bond they were forming, the musical telepathy they were developing. Night after night, show after show, they were learning each other's rhythms, anticipating each other's moves, becoming less a group of individuals and more a single organism with many parts. For Richard, who had spent much of his life feeling disconnected from the world, this unity was revelatory. When they played together, he didn't just feel understood, he felt complete. In 1965, everything changed. Bob Dylan, the folk music prophet who had electrified Newport Folk Festival and alienated his acoustic purists, needed a backing band for his new direction. He wanted musicians who understood roots music but could also rock, who had authenticity but weren't precious about it. The Hawks were perfect. Suddenly, Richard Manuel and his bandmates were thrust into the center of a cultural revolution. Dylan's decision to go electric was treated by folk purists as betrayal, as selling out, as the death of authenticity. Shows were chaotic, half the audience booing, half cheering, Dylan defiant on stage, the Hawks holding down a sound that was simultaneously ancient and futuristic. For Richard, the Dylan tours were thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. Here he was, backing one of the most important artists of the generation, playing to huge crowds, making music that felt genuinely innovative. But the hostility from the audience was intense. Night after night, people shouted insults, booed, walked out. It required a thick skin that Richard didn't have. Off stage, Dylan recognized something in Richard. A kindness, a sensitivity, a soul that was simultaneously strong and fragile. They became close in the way that artists do when they recognize themselves in each other. Dylan wrote songs with Richard in mind, understanding that Richard's voice could convey complex emotions: longing, regret, hope, despair, sometimes all in a single phrase. Dylan wrote in riddles. Richard sang them like confessions. The touring ended in 1966 after Dylan's motorcycle accident, but by then the bond between Dylan and the Hawks was sealed. When Dylan retreated to Woodstock to recover, the Hawks followed, renting a house they called Big Pink. What happened next would become legendary in music history. In the basement of Big Pink, Dylan and the Hawks recorded hours of music. Traditional songs, new compositions, experiments, jokes, everything. They called them the basement tapes, and they weren't meant for public consumption. They were musicians playing for the pure joy of it, with no commercial pressure, no audience expectations, just the pleasure of making sound together. For Richard, the Big Pink sessions were paradise. This was music as he had always imagined it should be. Intimate, honest, unfiltered by industry demands. He sang lead on several tracks, his voice capturing a world weariness that seemed impossible in someone so young. When he sang, you believed him, believed that he had lived the stories even when they were fictional, believed that the emotion was real even when it was performed. He didn't sing songs. He built sanctuaries made of sorrow. Out of these sessions came a sound that would reshape American music. The Hawks, who officially renamed themselves the band, began working on their own album, Music from Big Pink. Released in 1968, it was a deliberate rejection of psychedelic excess and acid rock bombast. Instead, the band offered something quieter, rootsier, more emotional. They sounded old in the best possible way, as if they were channeling ghosts of American music past. Richard contributed 3 songs to Big Pink, including In a Station and Lonesome Susie. But it was Whispering Pines, which appeared on their second album, that best captured his particular genius. A song about loneliness so profound it feels almost spiritual, sung in a voice that seems on the verge of breaking but never quite does. Critics called it a lullaby for lost souls. Richard called it Tuesday. He could hold a note longer than he could hold hope. Music from Big Pink was a critical triumph. Suddenly, the band wasn't just Dylan's backing group. They were artists in their own right, praised by everyone from the Beatles to Eric Clapton. Their second album, simply titled The Band, cemented their reputation. They had created something genuinely new by reaching backward, crafting a sound that felt both timeless and immediate. Richard should have been happy. He was successful, respected, doing exactly what he loved with musicians he considered family. But success brought complications he wasn't prepared for. There were more shows, bigger crowds, greater expectations. The attention he had always avoided was now unavoidable. Journalists wanted interviews where he was expected to explain his process, articulate his vision, package his art into quotable sound bites. Fans wanted autographs and photographs, wanted pieces of him he didn't know how to give. The industry wanted more albums, more tours, more product. The pressure manifested in ways both obvious and subtle. During recording sessions, Richard would sometimes freeze up, unable to capture the magic that came so naturally in rehearsal. The presence of the tape machine, the knowledge that this version would be permanent, trapped him in self-consciousness. Producer John Simon later recalled watching Richard attempt the same vocal take 15 times, each one technically perfect but lacking the emotional authenticity that defined his best work. He was trying to manufacture spontaneity, Simon said. And Richard was never a manufacturer. He was a medium. The music had to flow through him, not from him. There were also the reviews which praised the band's music but often singled out Robbie Robertson as the genius behind it all, relegating the others to talented supporting players. Richard, who had co-written many of their most affecting songs, who had poured his soul into every vocal, was frequently described as the sensitive one or the emotional voice, descriptors that felt reductive, diminishing. He didn't want credit for credit's sake, but the constant misrepresentation of his contributions fed into his existing insecurities, the voice that told him he was less than, that his gifts were somehow inferior. And beneath the success, the old anxieties remained, now amplified by the pressure of maintaining what they had built. Richard's drinking, which had been heavy during the Hawks years, became heavier. He added pills to the mix, uppers to perform, downers to sleep, whatever was available to quiet the noise in his head. His bandmates noticed but didn't know how to help. Confrontation wasn't the band's style. They believed in letting each member find his own way. And besides, they were all drinking, all using something. The line between recreational use and dependency was blurry in rock and roll culture, especially in the late 1960s when drug use was seen as consciousness expansion rather than escape. Richard seemed to be functioning, still showing up, still performing at a high level. The problems seemed manageable, but they weren't manageable, not really. Richard was beginning to slip away, even as he stood on stage every night giving everything he had to the music and the audience. There was a photograph from 1970 taken backstage after a particularly grueling show that captured something essential about Richard's state. In it, he's sitting alone in a corner, still in his performance clothes, staring at nothing. His eyes are hollowed out, exhausted beyond sleep. His hands rest on his knees, empty of purpose now that there's no piano beneath them. He looks like a man who has just returned from somewhere very far away and isn't sure how to be back in his body. Back in the regular world where music isn't playing and meaning has to be found elsewhere. Rick Danko kept that photograph in his wallet for years after Richard's death, would take it out occasionally and stare at it, looking for clues he had missed in real time. "That picture is the whole story," he said once. "Richard was already gone. We just didn't know it yet. He'd found out something on those stages, something about what it costs to make that kind of music, and it had broken something inside him that couldn't be fixed." By the mid-1970s, the band was showing strain. The relentless touring, the internal tensions, the various addictions, it was taking a toll. Robbie Robertson, who had emerged as the group's primary songwriter and de facto leader, was increasingly frustrated with the lifestyle. The others, particularly Levon Helm, resented what they saw as Robbie's controlling tendencies and his claim to songwriting credits they felt should be shared. Richard was caught in the middle, too gentle to take sides, too conflict-averse to fight for himself. He watched as the brotherhood that had sustained him began to fracture, and he felt powerless to stop it. When Robbie announced that the band would do a farewell concert and then quit touring, Richard agreed. What else could he do? The choice was between stopping or breaking completely, and at least stopping was intentional. The Last Waltz, staged on Thanksgiving Day 1976 at San Francisco's Winterland Ballroom, was meant to be a celebration, a grand farewell to the road, featuring an all-star lineup of guests including Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, and others. Martin Scorsese filmed it for a documentary that would become one of the greatest concert films ever made. On stage that night, Richard looked tired, beautiful, and doomed. When he sang with Dylan, his voice carried an ache that was almost unbearable to hear. Robbie Robertson would later say, "It felt like he was already saying goodbye. Not just to touring, but to something larger, more final." The crowd applauded. Richard mistook it for forgiveness. After the Last Waltz, the band officially disbanded. The members pursued solo projects with varying degrees of success and enthusiasm. Robbie Robertson moved into film scoring and production, finding a new creative outlet that didn't require the road. Levon Helm returned to his roots, playing smaller venues, reconnecting with the music that had first drawn him in. Rick Danko and Garth Hudson took session work, toured sporadically, stayed active in the music world. For Richard, the loss of the group was devastating in ways that went beyond professional disappointment. The band hadn't just been his job. It had been his identity, his purpose, his family, the context that made his life make sense. Without it, he was unmoored, adrift in a world that suddenly felt too large and too empty. They stopped calling me to play. The silence was louder than applause. He tried to adapt. He joined other projects, played keyboards for various artists, sat in on recording sessions, accepted invitations to perform. But nothing felt right. Nothing felt like the band, like that brotherhood, that musical telepathy they had developed over decades. Playing with other musicians felt like speaking a foreign language, technically possible but emotionally exhausting. The ease, the intuitive understanding, the sense that music was a shared conversation rather than a transaction, all of that was gone. Richard attempted a solo career, recording tracks that showed his songwriting ability hadn't diminished. But the business of being a solo artist, the self-promotion, the interviews, the responsibility of carrying a show alone, was antithetical to his nature. He had always been most comfortable as part of something larger, a voice in a chorus rather than a solitary performer. The spotlight he had avoided within the band became inescapable as a solo act, and it paralyzed him. There were also personal failures that compounded the professional ones. His marriage dissolved, another relationship unable to withstand the weight of his depression and addiction. His children grew up largely without him, raised by their mother while Richard spiraled through various attempts at stability. He would later speak with deep regret about his failures as a father, about missing birthdays and school events, about being physically present but emotionally absent during the times he did show up. The guilt became another weight he carried, another proof of his inadequacy as a human being despite his gifts as a musician. The drinking that had been bad became catastrophic. There were arrests for drunk driving, blackouts where entire days disappeared, missed gigs that damaged his reputation and limited his opportunities. Friends who tried to intervene found themselves confronting a man who seemed determined to destroy himself slowly, methodically, with the same dedication he had once brought to music. Intervention after intervention failed. Rehab programs couldn't stick. Therapy sessions revealed the depth of his pain but couldn't alleviate it. What made it all worse was Richard's awareness of his own decline. He wasn't ignorant of what was happening. He could see himself disintegrating, could recognize the pattern even as he felt powerless to change it. In a late interview, he said, "I know what I'm doing to myself. I'm not stupid. I just can't seem to stop. It's like watching yourself in a movie, you know? You want to yell at the screen, tell the guy to turn around, but you can't. You just have to watch it play out." This self-awareness without agency is perhaps the cruelest aspect of addiction and depression. Understanding intellectually what needs to change while being emotionally incapable of making that change. Richard could see the shore but couldn't swim to it. He knew he was drowning but had forgotten how to stay afloat. And every day that passed, the distance between who he was and who he had been grew larger, until the gap felt unbridgeable. In the early 1980s, the band reunited, but without Robbie Robertson, who had moved on to other projects. They toured, made albums, and on stage they could still create magic. But off stage, Richard was barely holding on. His health was deteriorating. His relationships were strained. He spoke about feeling tired, bone-tired, soul-tired. Friends who saw him in those final years spoke of a man who seemed to be fading, becoming translucent. He talked about music in the past tense, as if it were something that had happened to him rather than something he was still doing. In interviews, he seemed distant, disconnected, his responses brief and wistful. On March 3, 1986, the band played a show in Winter Park, Florida. By all accounts, Richard performed well. After the show, he went back to his motel room. What happened in those final hours only Richard knows. Did he decide suddenly, impulsively? Or had he been moving toward this moment for years, the way a river moves toward the sea, inevitably, inexorably? What we know is that Richard Manuel, who sang so he wouldn't drown, finally stopped swimming. The funeral was small, private, devastating. Levon Helm sang Whispering Pines alone, his voice breaking on the high notes, in an empty room that felt too quiet without Richard's piano. Robbie Robertson spoke, though later he would say he remembered nothing of what he said, only that it felt inadequate, that no words could capture what they had lost. Bob Dylan, who rarely attended funerals, came. He stood quietly in the back, and when it was over, he told someone that Richard had sung "I Shall Be Released" better than he ever could, that he had written it for Richard without knowing it, that some voices are so pure they hurt. The music world mourned, but the wider public barely noticed. Richard Manuel had never been famous in the way that rock stars are famous. There were no tabloid scandals, no reality TV appearances, no carefully managed public persona. He had lived quietly, suffered quietly, and died quietly. Only those who truly listened to the band's music understood what had been lost. Not just a voice, but a soul that could translate pain into beauty. In the years since his death, Richard Manuel's legacy has grown in ways he never could have anticipated. Musicians cite him as an influence, not just vocally but spiritually, as proof that vulnerability isn't weakness, that sensitivity can coexist with strength. His songs, particularly Whispering Pines and his performances on band classics, are studied and revered. But Richard Manuel didn't want to be studied. He wanted to be heard, to connect, to make people feel less alone through music. And in that, he succeeded beyond measure. Every time someone hears "I Shall Be Released" and feels their chest tighten, every time Whispering Pines makes someone remember a love they lost, every time the band's music provides comfort or companionship, Richard Manuel is there, still giving pieces of his soul away, still singing so others won't drown. The tragedy of Richard Manuel isn't that he killed himself, though that is tragic enough. The tragedy is that he couldn't see what everyone else saw, that his gift wasn't just his voice or his musicianship, but his humanity, his willingness to be broken in public, to show his wounds and call it art. He thought he was pretending, performing emotions he didn't really feel. But he was doing the opposite. He was being more real than most people dare to be, and it cost him everything. Can art save the artist, or does it only save the audience? Can someone give away too much of themselves through their work until there's nothing left to sustain their own life? Richard Manuel suggests the answer might be yes, that the very sensitivity that makes great art possible can also make ordinary life unbearable, that the ability to feel deeply is both gift and curse. In the end, Richard Manuel remains what he always was. A mystery, a paradox, a man who could make thousands feel understood while feeling utterly alone himself. He was not a rock star. He was a song that got lost. And now that song plays on, carried by others, hummed by strangers who never knew his name but know his voice. That voice that could break your heart mid-song. He didn't end the song. He became it. On the desk in his final motel room, they found that unfinished note. Don't wait for the dawn. It's already here. What did he mean? Was it hope or resignation? A promise or a goodbye? We'll never know. But perhaps that's appropriate. Richard Manuel spent his life singing lyrics he didn't entirely write, expressing emotions he couldn't fully name, creating beauty from confusion. Why should his final message be any clearer? What we can say with certainty is this. The world is quieter without Richard Manuel's voice in it, and that silence echoes louder than any applause he ever received. The music came easy. Living didn't. And in the end, the music wasn't enough to keep him here, but it's enough to keep him remembered. Every time someone puts on the band's records, Richard Manuel performs again. Every time a young musician discovers whispering pines and feels something shift inside them, Richard's gift continues. He wanted to be a song, and he got his wish. Not the kind that plays on the radio and fades, but the kind that becomes part of the landscape of human emotion, evergreen and aching and true. When he stopped singing, the silence didn't fill the room. It became the song. There are souls that don't die. They just become music. And Richard Manuel's voice, that voice that angels stop to hear, still whispers through the pines, still promises release, still reminds us that beauty and pain are not opposites but twins, born together, inseparable, necessary. Richard Manuel didn't vanish. He modulated, from melody to memory, from pain to permanence. If every note is a piece of the soul, how many songs can a man survive? And when the music outlives the musician, is that immortality or mercy?